Hi, we're talking today to Laura Gogia, who is, well, she has quite an interesting background. I'm going to ask her to tell you a little bit about that and to tell us a little bit about what it means to be a connected learning coach. So a little bio and then the coaching part. Laura Gogia.
What Gardner is alluding to is the fact that I started out as an obstetrician and gynecologist working in rural Virginia. And what I found as I was working in the country was that I felt very isolated, and I didn't have a good way of putting together a support network of other physicians, of other women in medicine. And I found that really hurt me in my career as far as not being able to make those connections. I was just too far away from other people who were having the same experiences as myself. So I actually ended up leaving medicine. And through a series of informational interviews and coursework and just serendipitous events, I ended up in a educational research and evaluation program at Virginia Commonwealth University, and got my PhD in educational research and evaluation. And during that time, I had the pleasure to work with Gardner Campbell and John Becker and everyone at the Virginia Commonwealth University Academic Learning Transformation Lab. And that was where I learned about connected learning. And the idea of learning through fostering connections across disciplines, across context, as far as home and work and our community and our professional lives. The idea of making connections to create a personal learning network where you're getting support, you're getting feedback, you're sharing what you're doing with people, sometimes on a global scale. All of that really struck a chord with me. I think a lot because of my previous experiences and difficulties when I was practicing medicine, as far as that's what I was missing. That was the piece of the puzzle that made my practice unsustainable for me. So it really struck a chord. I ended up completing my PhD, and my dissertation research focused on connected learning in the higher education environment, and how to capture it, how to assess student learning in these sorts of environments. And as part of that process, I really began to study how people were making connections, because that's what I was trying to assess, right? So I started learning how students were making connections through their blogging and their tweeting and their other digital activities. And I began speaking on that, writing on that, doing all sorts of consulting work around that. After I left VCU, I ended up working for the State Council for Higher Education for Virginia in doing data dissemination and data visualization, which is interesting because, again, what you're trying to do is express ideas in ways that are accessible to people who are coming from different perspectives. And so this idea of information dissemination really feeds into connected learning. And then eventually I've now landed back at Virginia Commonwealth University as the Associate Director for the Gracie Harris Leadership Institute, where I'm working on helping people develop connected leadership in terms of looking at leading as a holistic sort of thing, not just something that we do for productivity outcomes and so forth. Okay, so in the midst of all of that, I was working with VCU Division of Community Engagement to put together a course, which was called Curious Collaboration, or actually it's Collaborative Curiosity. And it was a connected learning course, an online course for graduate students that was open to the community as well, with the idea that people from the community and graduate students could get together and learn about community-engaged research, and do so by creating an online environment, a community. So it was kind of a community talking about community for research, which is a very interesting concept unto itself. But as we were developing that course, we discovered that a lot of people, participants and instructors, just had some problems getting through the basics of what it meant to blog, what it meant to express themselves through these digital platforms. And so it was helpful to have another person who we called the Connected Learning Coach to be there to provide feedback, to point out how connections were being made, like what people were doing really well, how they could make other connections that maybe they had just missed the first time around, and just provide feedback around making connections in these digital platforms. So the Connected Learning Coach was there, essentially just a coach, not to provide grades or any sort of formal feedback. It was more an informal peer coaching type situation from somebody who had a background in blogging.
So we're very fortunate that Laura is going to be our Connected Learning Coach for our Open Learning 17 Connectivist online course, all devoted to the many opens. I like to sum it up as all the opens connected. Really an overview of open as something that gets talked about a lot and yet has a lot of nuance and even some internal tensions. Let me ask you a quick biographical question, Laura, which is, I think of you and Robin DeRosa as two people who are new enough to this kind of full-on life of connectedness that you probably can remember before you were doing all of these things. I've been at this for a long time. I don't remember what it was like not to do these things. Sometimes that's a liability. I have a lot of experience, but it's that threshold moment that I'm curious about, where someone who sees there might be potential value, but either because of reluctance of one kind or another, or because of some understandable skepticism about the digital medium, about the internet or the web, hasn't yet made that move. So can you remember what sorts of things began to move you in the direction of being more connected in your learning across these digital platforms, and what kinds of things you had to overcome to kind of push yourself over that threshold?
Right. Well, I came to Connected Learning through a PhD program, and I think that most people, at least the ones who get a lot out of their PhD work, are searching for something that was missing in their life before. And for me, there was that, again, going back to my past in medicine in rural Virginia, that sense of isolation, that sense of not making an impact or being able to see my impact. And so that was the piece of working in the open that has driven me forward into making it essentially a way of life for myself. So my first real online, I did blog for my classes. I was expected to blog reflectively, and I enjoyed that because I like to write and I like reflective writing. But what really got me excited was when you introduced me to Twitter. And you introduced me to a Twitter friend of yours in the field of medicine. You were trying to link up two practitioners. And she just happened to be attending a conference that weekend, a medical conference, and live tweeting the conference. And so I spent a weekend watching her tweet a conference. And I started engaging with the people at the conference. And that's when I started to realize, I felt like I was at the conference and people were talking to me, and I was getting follows, and I was following people, and that's when I realized what I had been missing, and that I could sit in my kitchen in Virginia and actually feel like I was attending a medical conference in Canada, having really critical thinking type dialogue with physicians who were from the UK. And so that level of connectedness it was just amazing to me, and suddenly I didn't feel isolated anymore. Once I started engaging in that activity, then the drive was, well, how do I express myself better? Because Twitter can only take you so far. It's meant for dialogue. It's meant for a nearly synchronous or synchronous type conversation. And that's great, and we need that. But sometimes you need longer formats. Sometimes you need a place that just gives you something more than Twitter does. And that's when I started piecing together my platforms. And so my workflows across these platforms developed over time, but really was driven by this need to express myself. So whatever the project was, however I needed to collaborate, wherever my collaborators were. Okay, because that's another thing, video conferencing. We have tons of different types of video conferencing platforms, but I noticed that people in America tended to use Skype. My friends in the UK tended to use Google Hangouts. So wherever your collaborators are, you're going to take different pathways through the different platforms to get to them.